I'd explored every abandoned subway station in New York that I knew about. City Hall Loop, the gorgeous defunct jewel beneath Manhattan, the sealed-off platforms at Worth Street and 18th Street, even the half-finished shell of 76th Street on the 2nd Avenue line. But none of them compared to what I found beneath Canal Street. It started with rumors on urban exploration forums, posts about maintenance workers finding tunnels that weren't on any maps, stories of train operators seeing phantom platforms through the darkness between stations, and I dismissed them all until I found the blueprints, actual MTA documents from 1923 that showed a massive station complex planned beneath the intersection of Canal and Broadway. Now, I should mention that I'm not some amateur thrill seeker. I've been documenting abandoned subway infrastructure for over a decade, publishing my findings in underground magazines and private forums. My apartment walls are covered in vintage transit maps, and I've built relationships with retired MTA workers who's shared stories that never made it into official records. But these blueprints were different. They were stamped with an unfamiliar variant of the Transit Authority seal. Something about the angles seemed wrong. The lines were just too sharp, as if drawn by someone who'd only had the real seal described to them. The more I studied those blueprints, the more unsettling details emerged. The station's design incorporated architecture elements that didn't really exist in the 1920s. Strange angles and spatial relationships that reminded me of Escher drawings. In the margins, I found handwritten notes in faded ink. Most were illegible, but one clear phase kept repeating. The space between spaces. Another note, partially smudged, mentioned something about displacement during construction. I spent weeks cross-referencing city records, trying to find any mention of the construction crew that would have worked on this project. There was nothing. No payroll records, no accidents reported, no documentation at all. The access point was almost too easy to find. A service door in the Canal Street JZ station. Its lock broken many years ago. It led to a maintenance corridor that smelled of rust and stagnant water. My headlamp carved a weak circle through the darkness as I followed the gentle downward slope, and the air grew colder with each step. Now I'd come prepared. Backup batteries, 2 headlamps, a detailed hand-drawn map of the known maintenance corridors, and an old analog compass that had never failed me before. The compass started spinning the moment I closed that service door behind me. I should have turned back then. Any experienced urban explorer knows that when your tools start failing, it's nature's way of telling you to retreat. But curiosity has always been my fatal flaw. The first warning sign came when I checked my phone to document the entrance. Every photo I took came out distorted, with strange patterns overlaying the image. In one shot, I caught what looked like a figure standing in the background, though I'd been alone in the corridor. The figure appeared to be wearing clothing from another era, perhaps a 1920 suit, but its proportions were wrong. It was stretched too tall and too thin. I deleted the photos immediately, telling myself it was just the trick of the light. I wish I'd kept them now. They might have proven I wasn't imagining what came next. After 20 minutes of walking, the corridor opened into something impossible. My light couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The space was vast, larger than Grand Central's main concourse, larger than any subway station I'd ever seen. Row after row of pristine columns stretched into the darkness. Their marble facade showed no wear, no grime, no sign that nearly a century had passed since their construction. My footsteps echoed forever. Each sound bounced back at me from distances that shouldn't exist under Manhattan. The platform tiles gleamed as if they'd been just placed yesterday. White and black checkerboard patterns that played tricks on my eyes when I tried to follow them to their vanishing point. And at one point, I heard what sounded like footsteps mirroring my own, always staying just far enough away to be lost in the echo chamber of the station. I called out, my voice bouncing back at me in distorted waves. The steps stopped. I stopped. Then they started again, perfectly matching my pace. I spun around, sweeping my headlamp across the endless columns, but the beam seemed to bend and warp before it could reach whatever was making those sounds. The steps continued, and I realized with growing unease that they were now coming from multiple directions at once. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the beam of my headlamp. The cold had a weight to it, pressing against my skin like a physical presence. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadow wasn't the only thing moving in this place. The tiles themselves seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The checkerboard pattern would be different every time I turned back, as if the black and white squares were rearranging themselves just outside my field of vision. I started taking photos to document the changes, but each picture showed a completely different pattern than what I'd seen when I took it. In one image, the tiles formed a perfect spiral that seemed to go on forever, making my head hurt if I looked at it for too long. I found a bench, the only piece of furniture I'd seen in this vast space, and sat down to collect my thoughts. The metal was ice cold through my jeans, and something about its design seemed off. Like the blueprints, it incorporated elements that shouldn't exist, angles that seemed to bend in impossible ways when viewed from different positions. I reached out to touch one of these paradoxical curves, and for a moment, my hand seemed to pass through the solid metal. I jerked back, heart pounding, and watched in horror as ripples spread across the bench's surface like it was made of liquid mercury. Then I saw it. It was a dark shape ducking behind a column about 50 yards away. My first thought was that I'd found another urban explorer, or maybe someone who'd made this impossible space their home. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice sounding flat and dead in the vast chamber. I jogged toward the column, my footsteps creating a disorienting percussion against the phantom steps that still echoed around me. But when I reached the spot, I found only another platform stretching into the darkness. As I turned to leave, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The same shadow, this time sliding behind a column in the opposite direction, much further away than anyone could have moved in that time. The shape seemed wrong somehow, too tall, too fluid in its movement. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but when I opened my eyes, I saw it again, even further away, as if it was playing some impossible game of hide-and-seek across distances that shouldn't be there. There were no tracks, no third rail, no signal boxes or signs or even advertisements, which is pretty strange for a city like New York. Just endless platforms that seemed to branch and multiply the further I walked. I found myself counting my steps, trying to orient myself, but the numbers stopped making sense. 100 yards in any direction should have put me under the East River, or Brooklyn, or somewhere else entirely. In what I thought was the furthest corner of the station, I found something that still haunts my dreams. A single wooden ticket booth, its wood dark with age. It stood alone in the vastness. Unlike everything else in this place, It showed signs of decay, except for the brass ticket window, which gleamed as if it were newly polished. Through the window, I could see an ancient ticketing machine, its digital display impossibly showing today's date. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. On the counter lay a single subway token, and next to it, my own wallet, the same wallet that was currently in my back pocket. I reached back to check, and sure enough, my wallet was still there. And so, with trembling hands, I opened it and I found my driver's license missing. The license laying on the ticket counter was mine, but the issue date read 1923. My hands trembling, I picked up the token. It was warm to the touch despite the crushing cold of the station. The metal seemed to pulse with a faint rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and when I held it up to my headlamp, I saw that instead of the usual NYC Transit Authority text, it bore symbols that I'd never seen before, shapes that seemed to move and change as I rotated the token in my fingers, similar to a hologram. I pocketed it without thinking, and the moment I did, all the lights in my pack flickered simultaneously. The symbols on the token began appearing elsewhere. I found them scratched into the tiles, etched into the columns, even reflected in the puddles of water that shouldn't have been there given how dry the station was. Each time I spotted them, they seemed to be arranged differently, forming patterns that made my head swim. One particular arrangement kept repeating, 7 symbols in a semicircle. I sketched it in my notebook, and later that night, I found the same pattern that somehow transferred itself onto my bathroom mirror, drawn in condensation that appeared, despite no one taking a shower. A sound echoed through the station then, the distant screech of ancient brakes, followed by the distinctive whoosh of train doors opening. But there were no tracks here, no trains. I swung my light toward the noise, and for a split second, I thought I saw passengers standing on the platform. Dozens of them, all wearing clothes from a bygone era, all standing perfectly still, all facing away from me. When I blinked, they were all gone, but the token in my pocket grew warmer. The worst part of all this was the silence. Not just quiet, it was true silence. The kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your blood moving through your veins. No distant trains, no water dripping, no hum of electricity. Cities aren't supposed to have spaces this quiet. Now, last week I found something that finally made me stop searching. In my mailbox was an envelope yellowed with age, postmarked 1923. Inside was a letter written in my own handwriting, but the ink was fresh. "Stop looking," it read. "Some doors only open one way. Some stations serve different kinds of trains. If you see yourself on the platform, don't make eye contact, and whatever you do, don't take the token when it's offered." I already made that mistake. The letter was signed with my name, but below it was a series of those same strange symbols I'd seen on the token. The token that, since that day, has been slowly but steadily growing warmer in my desk drawer. The logbook had another detail that I can't shake as well. Every few pages there were Polaroid photos paperclipped to the entries. They showed the same scene, the station, but from a different angle, as if the photographer had been floating near the ceiling or standing in places that defied physics. In one photo dated 1994, I saw myself in the background, wearing the exact clothes I was wearing now, examining what appeared to be a logbook. And when I looked up from the photo, I caught a glimpse of movement near the door, someone walking away with a Polaroid camera, but the figure was too far away by the time I reached the doorway. On my way out of the room, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Fresh Polaroids scattered on the floor, showing me reading the logbook moments ago, from angles that would have required the photographer to be standing where solid walls existed. Now, at some point during my exploration, I found a payphone mounted on one of the columns. It looked pristine, like everything else in this place, but its design was ancient, straight out of the 1920s. As I passed it, it rang. The sound echoed through the station like a gunshot. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver, knowing I shouldn't answer it, knowing nothing in this place could possibly be connected to any real phone lines. But I picked it up anyway. Through waves of static, I heard my own voice, aged and trembling, reciting numbers that I recognized as dates, all of them years in the future. The last thing I heard before the line went dead was myself whispering, "They're not dates, they're depths." The phone's cord, I noticed as I hung up, wasn't even connected to anything. It ended in a clean cut just inches from the base, swaying gently in the air that shouldn't have been moving. Near what might have been the center of the station, I found a maintenance room. Unlike the rest of the station, this room was small, it was cramped, and it felt almost normal, until I noticed the logbook on the desk. Again, another logbook. Its pages were filled with entries dating from 1923 to 2025, all written in the same handwriting. The last entry was dated tomorrow, but it was the entry from 1978 that really caught my eye. It was a detailed account of 3 maintenance workers who had wandered into the space between and encountered something that the writer had scratched out so violently the pen had tore through several pages. In the margins was a cruel drawing of what looked like a transit map, but the lines curved in ways that hurt my eyes to follow, spiraling into some kind of central point that the artist had simply labeled as the Wait. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've become obsessed with early subway construction documents, searching for any mention of the Phantom Station. I've interviewed dozens of transit workers, and while most dismiss me, a few go quiet when I mention Canal Street. One old-timer, his hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. He told me about a maintenance crew that disappeared for 3 days in 1978, and when they finally emerged, they refused to speak about where they'd been. All 3 quit their jobs the next day. The official report listed it as an unauthorized break, but he remembered seeing their faces when they came back up. They saw something down there, he told me, crushing his half-smoked cigarette. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. Now I walked for what felt like hours. My GPS had stopped working the moment I entered the maintenance corridor. My phone showed no signal, and its clock was frozen at 3:47 p.m., the first time I'd stepped through that service door. When I finally found my way back to the corridor, I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook. I ran until I burst through the service door into the familiar grime and noise of Canal Street Station, where an F train was just pulling in as if nothing had happened. Now I've tried to find that door again. I've spent weeks searching every inch of Canal Street Station, but it's gone now as if it never existed. And sometimes, late at night, I take the J train downtown, and as we pass through Canal Street, I press my face against the window and I stare into the darkness between stations. Sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of pristine white tiles gleaming in the dark, stretching away into impossible distances. But I don't go looking for that door anymore. Some spaces are not meant to be explored. Some places exist in the gaps between what's real and what isn't. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you find in those places. It's the possibility that you might never find your way out.